All right, welcome everybody. I hope you enjoyed our three lectures with Dr. Gregory Beeman on soundscapes in New Orleans um, from about 1860 to the 1970s. So I hope you enjoyed that. His research was absolutely impressive. So I hope you're taking advantage of that. We're going to continue on with some more great speakers talking about the rich history of culture of Louisiana. And we're going to be talking about a very interesting subject tonight. Our speaker tonight is the founder of Jason Theriot Consulting. He's an author and historian and consultant. And he's going to be talking about his latest book, Frenchie, the story of the French-speaking Cajuns of World War II, which came out late last year. And I want to welcome Dr. Jason Theriot tonight to talk about this unbelievable story. I can't imagine this story is not going to be amazing to listen to.
Thanks for having me, Jason. And it's a pleasure to be here with you and all of your members of your great organization. Um, I love being down in the Cabildo in the Quarter. I was just there last week at as an invited guest at the residence of the French consulate at his home in New Orleans, Consul Sambou. And in partnership with the Alliance Francaise, they had me come and talk about this project that I've been working on for 25 years. So I'm 50. That gives you a sense of how long I've been working on this. So it's half of my life I've been working to document and tell the story of World War II veterans in that great generation. So it's a pleasure to be here with you guys tonight. And let me know when to begin, or I guess I already did.
Hey, we're having a little, let me see if someone said, they're having a little trouble hearing you.
Okay.
Um,
Is this a little better? I turned
it
up the
sounds
volume.
good to me. Can anybody let me know if that sounds okay?
Testing 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3.
It sounds good on my end, so I think you should, yeah, keep on going.
Everybody else okay? Can y'all hear me okay?
I think it's okay now. Hmm.
All right. So, Jason, do I just take the floor?
Yeah, go ahead. Love to hear more
Okay.
about this book. Yeah.
Well, so my name is Jason Theriot. I'm from South Louisiana, born and raised in Iberia Parish, and I have see my background. I have a journalism, broadcast journalism degree from LSU, and a master's and a PhD in history from the University of Houston. So I've been living here 24, 20, 25 years now, since 2000. So yeah, this is a passion project of mine. I got started. Um, One of the catalysts was the opening of the National D-Day Museum. You folks in New Orleans remember that? How long ago was that? 25 years ago, this summer. That's right. I got a really cool poster right there from the grand opening. So that was for those who remember that one little building with the little coffee shop and um, you know 25 years ago, it's become such a major attraction for New Orleans and the Gulf South. Obviously, I'm sure you guys have all been there. Could be louder, perhaps move closer. How's that? Move a little closer. Thank you, Mary Lynn. Is that a little better? Hope that's a little better because my audio is pegged all the way, but I'm on a little old laptop, so hopefully this works. Um, yeah, so I got started interviewing my grandfathers. They were both in the Pacific War in the Navy, and I was working at a television station at the time here in Houston, Fox Sports. And that one little, those two little interviews became, oh, Jason, can you interview my friends down the street? And so this was in 2000, 2001, 2. And before you know it, I had interviewed 50 or so World War II veterans from my hometown in New Iberia Parish. And, the idea was just to do a little small book. And 5 years later, I had published, self published, a 3-volume book series called To Honor Our Veterans, an oral history of World War II veterans from the Bayou Country, volume 1, 2, and 3. And these are all little vignette stories from those individuals who I had interviewed over the course of those 5 years, probably about 100 interviews or so I had done. And I was mainly interested in capturing their story. And I recorded all those interviews with a little micro cassette recorder. Jason and I were talking earlier about those old oral histories that the Cabildo has from the 1970s and 80s, probably a similar medium used back then as I was using. I had no intentions of becoming a professional historian, or spending 25 years to ultimately write this book. Um, but during the course of that project, and like I said, I interviewed about 100. These are men and women from South Louisiana. It expanded the area of research kind of expanded all the way west to the west side of Lafayette and all the way to Houma and Thibodaux in that area. People started hearing about what I was doing, and I'd go pick up my grandfather and drive him to these interviews with me because he could speak French. Unfortunately, as we all know, that generation for the large part did not pass it on to the baby boomers, so therefore my generation did not have the benefit of growing up with French in the home. But a common denominator of all of those from that World War II generation from South Louisiana, they grew up speaking French. And they grew up speaking French as their first language. And they learned English later on, right? Most of them descendants of the Acadians, or sort of intermarried over time with other francophones from South Louisiana. So I don't know, maybe the 15th or 20th interview that I did was with a fella, excuse me, from Church Point, Louisiana, right up in Acadia Parish. And he was telling me that how he joined the military, and his name was Bernice Lejeune, okay, and sweet old man, and what a neat little accent he had. Anyway, he told me the story of how he went to the recruiting station in 1942, and the recruiting officer asked him, "Okay, so do you speak any foreign languages?" And he says, "Yeah, yeah, well, and I'll speak two languages." And he told me, he said, the officer says, "Oh, I'm sorry, son, but the Army has no use for that type of French," because he pegged him as a Cajun with a broken French, corrupt French, if you might call it back then, and certainly identified his last name, Lejeune, as being Cajun. Lo and behold, he ends up in an aircraft unit in North Africa for the invasion, 1942, late 42, 43. And he's involved in a scuffle between some French soldiers and some American soldiers. And his commander, knowing that he can speak French, because his nickname was Frenchie, like all of the other Cajun GIs who served in World War II, they were nicknamed Frenchie by their commanders and by their buddies. Called him over to sort of separate this dispute. And from that moment until 2 years later, throughout the entire duration of the war, he served as an interpreter for a colonel in a Jeep, driving this guy around all of North Africa into Italy and southern France. And I thought, wow, that's a unique story. Can't be too many like that. Wrong. There were hundreds that I could document, maybe thousands that we'll never know, thousands that won't be documented. So that was, probably 2003, 4, 5. I'll fast forward after the publication of those 3 little self-published books. And if you folks want to, ask a question while we're going, that's fine. Just, I guess, put up your little hand in the windows there, and I'll gladly answer a question for you. So anyway, I have a little box over here with some goodies I'll pull out from now and again. But yeah, so that project kind of ended with volume 3, which was the European theater. I actually went on a tour with the Stephen Ambrose Historical Tour Company, who is my hero as far as World War II authors are concerned. And I went on that 60th anniversary of the D-Day invasion. In fact, I'm wearing the shirt right now just for you guys. Yeah. Kind of forgot I had that. So that was life-changing moment for any of you folks who have ever been to the Normandy beaches. You know what I'm talking about. It's quite an experience. So, but this was a hobby for me. I had a job. I was working in sports television production, and I had this sort of side little hobby. Well, we'll fast forward many years. That hobby became um, more of a profession. So I went to graduate school, got a PhD. I actually wrote my master's thesis. Yeah, this is important. I wrote my master's thesis, Cajuns in World War II, Jason Theriot. It's like the only copy that exists. So this book sat on the shelf. I think it's a 2006 or seven, somewhere around there. Anyway, what I did is I went and interviewed another 50, and I was most interested in those who had the opportunity to use their Cajun French in some capacity, whether it was an interpreter, whether it was an unofficial interpreter for their unit, whether they were in intelligence or work for the Office of Strategic Services. Many of them, um, you know, left letters behind. I had the fortunate opportunity to interview a few of those from the OSS. A couple of them from New Orleans actually served in that capacity that I know of. So I wrote that master's thesis and then put the project away. And then a couple of 2 or 3 years later, the vast majority of those World War II veterans who I'd interviewed and gotten to know pretty well had passed on, including my grandfathers. So I went off to do other things. I have one of my first jobs was a postdoc fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, 2011, something like that. And so from there, I started my own consulting business. And I had the fortunate opportunity to find some clients who were interested in doing various kinds of archival research, a couple of company history books that I got involved with. I didn't pull any of those out, but I've done, 5 or 6 or 7 of those. I also help people produce their memoirs, their family memoirs, either in book form or in video form. I've got that background in television, broadcasting, and video. So I do a lot of that today, and so that's kind of my profession. But all along, I really wanted to finish this project in the right way and pay tribute to the last generation, because there aren't many of them left. And so the major event that kicked this off was I was invited to come give a set of presentations up in Moncton, New Brunswick in 2019 for the Congrès Mondial Acadien. It's a World Congress of Acadians that meets every 5 years. So I went up there, and on the plane ride back, I was sitting next to a guy from Codafield. You guys are probably familiar with that organization, Council for the Development of French in Louisiana. So Jason, you need to take this story all the way you need to finish it. So he encouraged me to do that. And from that moment, we decided, okay, I'm going to find the rest of the Frenchies who are still living. And I'm going to do a podcast show. And I'm going to write a book. So I did all of those 3 things in a couple of 2 or 3 years. And fortunately, I was able to find around 10 World War II veterans who had utilized their French in some capacity, and probably uncovered another 200 or 300 other stories from family members, from primary source letters at different places, from the benefit of having online newspaper searches. How many of you folks out there remember the days of the old microfilm in the library? Going through page by page by page by page by page. Well, now with the benefit of online archival newspapers, you can do keyword searches. Certainly with the subscription. So I mean, I found a couple of hundred or so articles where World War II veterans, Cajun Frenchies, are writing letters home from France, North Africa, New Caledonia, Belgium, somewhere, and they're saying, "Mom and Dad, hey, just want to let you know I'm doing well, and I've befriended a French family, and I'm living with them and I'm dating their daughter. And you wouldn't believe that that French that I was told to forget about when I was a kid has become such of a great value to me. And that's really the essence of the story of the Frenchies. If you think about it, and the numbers, they're a little difficult. By one account, Shane Bernard, in his book, Cajuns, Americanization of the People, Shane came up with a number about 25,000 Cajuns, native born Cajuns, served in World War II. And that's mainly looking at census data and looking at Acadian surnames on that census. We know there's a lot of Cajuns who didn't have Acadian surnames. My paternal grandfather was a Jackson, and he didn't speak English till he was 10 years old, and tracks his lineage all the way back to Acadie. So it's in the tens of thousands, right? All of them grew up speaking French as their first language. And the vast majority of them had difficulties learning English forcibly in grade school. We've all heard the stories. I've been told many stories by these World War II veterans. My dad's dad told the story of how he was forced to kneel on crushed pecan shells with short pants on in the corner because he couldn't ask to go to the bathroom in English. So we know this, those are well-known stories. The passage of the English only policy for public education in 1921, and some teachers and principals, they took it upon themselves to really follow that policy rigidly and forcibly, and unfortunately, many of these these young Cajun boys and girls who grew up during that period of time, suffered a level of discrimination that we probably couldn't even recognize today. And what that does to a young person, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, you can imagine the shame that it brought to them on their heritage and their family, and their French culture. But all of that changed beginning in December 1941, and the United States entered the war, and these Cajuns who grew up with that level of discrimination were 17, 18, 19 years old. And they were the ones who joined in mass, were the volunteer to join. And once they arrived in places like North Africa, France, all through France, so 42, 43, Italy, France, Belgium and Germany, and even in places like New Caledonia, which is a large French colony off the coast of Australia. 50,000 Francophones lived there. These Cajuns recognized that they had a tremendous asset for the military, for the Allied cause. They could speak 2 languages. In many cases, those who continued on after, let's say, middle school, 9th grade, they could read and write 2 languages. Some even went to college. Maybe they didn't finish a 4-year degree, but there's plenty of evidence from letters that I have found of many of them typing letters back home in perfectly good English. And I'll share some with you. All right. So I've got some actual copies of the letters, some letters that I found. This batch right here was from the Joel L. Fletcher papers at UL. Joel Fletcher was the president of the University of Southwestern Louisiana Institute. That's what it was called before it was USL, then UL. And so these are armed service people, young people who either knew Joel Fletcher or was associated with the university or had taken a class there or were alumni there. And I'll read just a few of these, okay? So this is from, let's see. This is from F.D. Theriot. He's in France in October of 1944. As Ordnance Liaison Officer, I have been able to see very much of France, and my Cajun, in quotation marks, my Cajun French has been very handy. In fact, my French is more correct than most of the dialects that I've heard in Normandy and Brittany. Think about that for a second. I've got many of these. I'm gonna just read a few of them. But for a young 18, 19-year-old Cajun GI to be writing about his Cajun culture in such a positive way was extremely rare for that time period. Very few Cajuns would have written like this in the 1940s. Again, this was a generation that had suffered through that forced learning of English in school at a very young age. And this generation was the fourth or fifth in line um, that had become part of this, the sort of what we refer to now as Cajun culture, the French Cajun people, right, descendants of Acadians. And so there was a stereotype of folks outside of the Cajun heartland. These would have been people in the bigger cities or Anglos or traveling journalists or writers who would have written stories and would have been, we might call it writing, stereotypical stories about the ignorant, uneducated, swamp dwelling Cajuns, with the webbed feet and Russell alligators, and don't worry about too much about what's going on around them. So that was sort of the worldview of people outside of the Cajun heartland, and even to a great degree, I would assume that many of these young Cajuns who had some education, maybe they felt the same way about their culture. But once they arrived on the world stage, boy, their skill sets and their talents really shined. And like I said, I've got hundreds of examples. I'll read you a few more. This one is from this is from Jim Brignac. I believe he was from Lafayette. He's in the Marianas, 1944. And he says, I lived in Opelousas, Abbeville, New Orleans, and finally Lafayette. I worked for Mike, sorry, I don't have my glasses on. I worked for Mike Donlin, the real estate agent, for a year and a half. Incidentally, I'm another Cajun, as you can tell by my name, and proud of it too. Just a few more. This one is from Homer Doucet. He's somewhere in France in November 44. This is also back to President Fletcher. My knowledge of the French language surely has stood me in good stead since I've been in France. I wouldn't give it for anything in the world, and spent half of my time acting as interpreter for the rest of the boys. So while I have been fortunate to run across maybe a dozen or more official interpreters, and when I say official interpreter, I mean on their MO, on their official military records, there is a code that classifies them as an interpreter. But for the vast majority, these Cajuns served as sort of unofficial interpreters of their unit, of their tank battalion, or their infantry company, or in headquarters, or on a Navy ship. So, and all of them were referred to as Frenchie. That's the title of the book. Let's see. Let me give you one more here. You guys doing good over there? Okay. How about this one? This one is from Lieutenant Rita Derwon. She was from St. Martinville. Now, she died in the 1990s, so I never got to meet her, but it was a letter from France in late 1944. I like France very much and feel perfectly at home. This particular spot where I'm stationed reminds me so much of the French Quarter in New Orleans. My knowledge of French is helping me considerably, not only in my work, but also in meeting French civilians. There you go. And as I mentioned, newspaper articles. So I'll just kind of raise up one right here. This is from, I think, the Lafayette newspaper. But there's plenty of these. I'll read it. It says, work as an interpreter in changeover of infantry unit on the Italian front, wins Bronze Star for a French-speaking Crowley soldier, the citation says. One more here. A little bit better font. This is, I think, Alfred Benoit. Yes. Lafayette man saved the day by talking French. In fact, interestingly enough, I gave a presentation at the Homa Regional Museum about 6 months ago, and this guy Alfred Benoit, his grandson, great grandson, tracked him down, and he was also in the military, and he came and gave presented us with some paraphernalia, some memorabilia from his Frenchie great grandfather. So there's plenty of those. Another collection that I found, very fortunate, is the St. Bernard Catholic Church in Breaux Bridge, Louisiana. A local historian by the name of Kenneth Delcom discovered a large collection of church bulletins from the 1940s in an attic somewhere in an old house in Breaux Bridge. And he compiled all of this material into a 4-volume series. And he gave me one of those volumes many years ago. And so for this Frenchie project, I actually went to the library where all of those bulletins, are archived there. And it's literally, hundreds and hundreds of individual little 4 or 5 sentence excerpts in the church bulletin. What the church bulletin was doing was sending a bulletin out to the men and women serving overseas. And then the men and women were reading about where their friends were located and then writing letters back home. And then the parents were sending those letters to the church. So it was like, long email chain, right? Connecting all of these Cajuns globally. And these were really fascinating. Now, if you think about Breaux Bridge, I mean, this is, pretty steeped in their French culture. Many of them, even those who served in the local National Guard unit, apparently they were still giving close order drill instruction in French, in their native Cajun French, when they were in basic training at Camp Landing, Florida, and then in Camp Bowie, Texas, when they ran into some problems with some of their Maudits Texians, their damn Texan neighbors. Didn't like those guys speaking French to each other. We'll get to that in a minute. But I'll just read you a few of these. It says here, Parlez-vous français? From Allied Forces Headquarters in the Mediterranean Theater, 1943. To this question, asked countless times a day, in this North African city, at least 90% of this military police company can say, "Mais oui." And when he says this police company, he means the National Guard unit from Breaux Bridge. When the National Guard, Louisiana National Guard, the 156, was federalized in November of 1940, there were 5 companies. There were 3 battalions and I believe 15 companies. And the 2nd battalion, which consisted of the companies from New Iberia, Breaux Bridge, St. Martinville, Lafayette, and Headquarters Company out of New Orleans, they were detached from their unit in Central North Africa as combat military police, primarily because they were bilingual. And so I found some references to that where the higher ups in the military actually wrote in the military order of battle, we're sending in this unit because of their French speaking abilities. So many of them were utilized in all kind of unique capacities. As some of these guys worked as in intelligence. They were answering the phones. They were censoring letters. A few of them worked in the Mediterranean, Allied Mediterranean headquarters. Some of them served as air traffic controllers. So again, there's the benefit of their French language. And I tell you what, I had the opportunity to interview probably 8 or 10 of them, 2002, 3, 4, 5, 6. And I've written about it, gave them presentations in different places. But one of the interesting things about this unit is they were probably, by the time they ended up in North Africa in 1942, arguably one of the most well-trained infantry units in the American military. They had been in the National Guard several years prior to the United States entering the war. They were well experienced soldiers, if you will, National Guardsmen, who in many ways ran the big Louisiana maneuvers in Alexandria, Fort Polk, Camp Beauregard in 1939, 1940, 41. So these were all veterans, by that time, 17, 18, 19 years old. They had a whole year of infantry training in Florida, and then 6 months of advanced training in Camp Bowie, Texas. So this was a rugged, hardy bunch, and very few of them actually saw any combat, because once they arrived in theater of operations, the military realized how valuable they were, because they were bilingual. And there was a presentation that I gave at the Acadian Memorial in St. Martinville, let's call it 2005 or 6. And there's a picture that I have, and there's about 10 of them in a horseshoe chair, sitting in chairs in the shape of a horseshoe, and all their family members are behind. And the director of the Acadian Memorial, a good friend of mine, Brenda Comotron, she said, "Look behind you. That's your legacy, and that's in large part because of your French heritage, because the military recognized the benefit of utilizing these folks because of their linguistics, because of their communication skills, and therefore kept them from the front lines, kept them from the intense battles in North Africa, in Italy, and southern France. And they all came back. All of them came back. Who all had families, kids and grandkids, and there we are, telling that story. So that's another legacy of the Frenchies. One more from that St. Bernard Church Bulletin. And oftentimes you'd have these letters where it's either one of the priests or someone who works for the church who's deciphering the letters. Oh, and by the way, there were a few letters that came back from overseas, from these Cajuns, written in French. All right, here we go. "Well, folks, don't ever let the boys and girls at school say or even think that the French that they learn or speak in good old little Brobridge is of no value when one is away from home. Here's an example which proves the contrary. A few words in our own dear French brought together 2 Brobridge boys before they were to leave and perhaps never meet again." So this is just a handful of these, really rich primary sources that, combined with all of those newspapers, combined with all the oral history interviews that I've done, and a ton of memorabilia that was either given to me or on loan to me from families over the many years, all of those little stories sort of created these micro vignettes of stories that are in the book Frenchie. And so Frenchie came out with UL Press, which is where all of my oral history interviews are located, and 95% of them are audio. It's since been digitized. If you want to go, you can go dig them up. And the last batch here, from the last, let's say, since 2020, so the last 5 years have been video interviews. And of that last 10, only 3 are still living. That's Norris Morvant, who is 100-year-old, still drives, lives in Thibodaux, Louisiana. He was a Frenchie in Chafe, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Forces, General Eisenhower's headquarters. And his job was every day or every other day to go out in a Jeep with a special pass and a special briefcase with some orders or small bits of equipment or whatever, and ride out into the French countryside and go deliver wherever he was supposed to deliver. And so he was, he was in the field for 9 months. He's still around. He's still good. I visited with him. Let's see, last week he was a special guest honored at the French consulate's home. And an interesting thing about Norris is because he was embedded so much with French people. In fact, he's got a famous photograph of him being a special guest at a wedding of this French couple that he had met their parents, somewhere outside of Paris. And there's, a table with all these French people for their wedding, and then there's this American soldier, dressed up in his GI uniform. And Norris said that when he came back home, his parents couldn't understand a word he said in French because he had spent so much time overseas with that other dialect. It took him a while. The other two are on the west side. So Shirley Guidry, I think he turns 100 years old this year. Shirley was from like the Lake Arthur area, and Shirley was an engineering battalion, and they built pontoon bridges across all the rivers all the way through France, and into across the Rhine. And then the third one, who's still living, is Prigent Fontenot, and he was in the Armored Division. He was in an armored truck and utilized his French to help communicate with the French civilians as this armored unit moved throughout France. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. The book came out last fall, and since then I've been able, fortunately, to have a number of events honoring these veterans where they've actually come to the event in their hometown, and had their families come. And so it's been a wonderful experience to finally, finally put a bookend on this project that's been 25 years. And a tremendous amount of oral history work that's been done for the next generation of scholars. And I may have only scratched the surface. Okay, so there's hundreds of letters still out there. We discovered a collection of over 700 tapes, small tapes, Jason, like you got, from the Little Museum in Kaplan, Louisiana. And these were high school kids who did interviews with World War II veterans from the Kaplan area for over 20 years. We just discovered that the other day. Of course, the World War II Museum, they've got a pretty rich database with several thousand, and you can keyword search, last names and whatnot. So there's plenty more out there. But I certainly appreciate having the opportunity to tell stories about the Frenchies. If you're interested to learn more, I have a website, jasontheriot.com. There's plenty of videos of these guys and others going back many, many years, little video vignettes that you'll see if you dig around. There's, of course, the Frenchie podcast. We are up to episode, I think, 18 right now. And if you want a copy of the Frenchie book, you can get it off of UL Press catalog, their website, ulpress.com, I believe, or is it .org. If you want an autographed copy, go down to Higgins Boulevard at the World War II Museum, at the bookstore there, and you walk through PJ's Coffee Shop, the old National D-Day Museum. I mean, it was just the one block. And there's a bookstore in there, and I just dropped off an autograph, like 30 books last week. Other than that, I'll sit back and will gladly answer any questions that you guys might have. Thank you.
Yeah, it really is a wonderful story. And it sounds like there's even more to dig into of sources that you can find and stuff like that. I did want to ask some questions. If you do have questions, please put them in the chat, but I'm going to go ahead and ask a couple questions. We always hear, and I know that the World War II Museum has maybe changed that perception a little bit, but we've always heard about World War II soldiers that didn't want to talk about the war. It seems that that is not the problem that you had at all, was it? Is getting them to want to talk about their experiences?
Well, that's a good question, and we'll put it in the proper context. So, if you okay, we'll start off with the year 2000 as sort of a beginning point. You had the museum open up, but let's back up a little bit. And if you back up to even to let's say 1984, when
Okay.
President Reagan gave his famous Boys of Point to Hawk speech, right? If you guys haven't heard that speech, you should go listen to it. It's one of his best. And if you think so, that would have been the 40th anniversary. So those guys would have been in their 50s and 60s. They weren't ready to talk, but some did, and some of them talked to Stephen Ambrose. Ambrose writes about how he went on that trip, and that's when he started interviewing these D-Day veterans. And gradually over years, he was compiling more and more and more material, more and more interviews. But from my experience, when I started contacting these World War II veterans in the year 2000, 2001, 2, 3, they had never told the vast majority of them had never told their stories to anybody. Maybe a grandchild who came over with a tape recorder for a history project in 8th grade, maybe. But other than that, they did not share stories um, with their friends. Yeah, they went to VFWs and American Legions, but this is not something that they talked about. And so it was really interesting because many of them were sharing their stories for the very first time. And so I was just, right place at the right time. Uh, I didn't have a video camera. I didn't have a bunch of equipment. I wasn't looking to, promote their story on TV. I was just, just a young guy with a. Let me show you the little piece of equipment I was using. Yeah, just a young guy, curious, with a little micro cassette tape, and that's really all I had. Um, and they would invite me into their living rooms, and the wife would pour some coffee, and we'd sit there, and they would just hit record and make sure I had enough batteries, and they would just talk and talk and talk. And some of the interviews were short, 30 minutes. Some of them wanted to go for a couple of hours. So like I said, I think I was just really lucky to be, right place at the right time.
And I obviously was, as someone who's done oral histories, having someone there. I mean, obviously, it's more about the introduction of having your grandfather there. Obviously, was a big deal for you, because that introduction probably set a nice base for them to kind of realize that this is what you're doing is a research project, and their stories need to be preserved. I mean, how many interviews do you think you did with your grandfather with you?
Probably half of those. So that was kind of
Yeah.
interesting because he, this is my favorite story. So when I first approached him, this goes back to your first question, and I asked him, I said, "Hey, I'd like to, do an interview about your World War II experience and maybe a couple of your friends." And he said, "Oh, Jason, that's not something that we talk about. Even my best friends, I don't know anything about what they did in the war." So I found this book, and it's called Honor Roll of Iberia Parish World War II Veterans, Men and Women Serving in Uniform. And it was published by the local newspaper in 46 and then reprinted again in 93. So I found this book, and they're all, little biographies with photographs, and it's all alphabetized. So I found this book, and I gave it to him, and I said, "Look, hey, take a look, see if you know any of your friends in there. There's about 1,500 in here." And he said, "Okay." And I came back the next weekend, and he said, and my grandfather was a jokester, and he said, "Jason, you wouldn't believe, man, I got good news." Well, I got some bad news too, but I got some good news. I said, "What's the good news?" He says, "I read through your book, and I found 50 of my closest friends, and I've contacted them, and I have their address and a little information about where they served, and they're ready to start being interviewed right now. Are you ready to go?" And I went, 50? I said, "No, no, no, no. It was you, my other grandfather, and maybe a friend or two. Like, this was not supposed to be you know, a project of that scale, 50. I said, "Wow. Okay, I guess we can get started. And I said, well, wait a minute, what's the bad news? He said, well, I only got to the bees. Literally, that's a true story. So
That's a good story.
that's kind of how it started. And I would drive from Houston, and I'd show up on Saturday morning, and he would come down the stairs, and my grandmother would wave to me, and he'd come down, and he'd have this Theriot reunion hat that his prize reunion hat from 1995. And he was a short fella, and he had kind of a big belly, and he would struggle to get into the truck. So I'd pull him in, and I'd have to snap the seatbelt for him, and then he'd have a little list. He'd have a list, and he had an ink pen in his hat. And okay, first of all, we're gonna go see Dot Broussard. She was a nurse, and she lives right down the street. You're not gonna believe the story. And he would go, and we'd go visit, and we'd interview Miss Dot Broussard, and we did that for years. And then gradually the newspapers caught on and what we were doing. And let's see if I got an example here. The newspapers caught on what we were doing, right? Their story, young native son writes World War II history from perspective of vets. And then, of course, Times of Acadiana, started doing radio interviews, going to every Rotary Club you could think of. And so that then the word started spreading. Hey, there's a guy interested in World War II veterans. Here's my address. Here's my phone number. People were sending me letters, and so then it sort of expanded, beyond just Iberia Parish. But yeah, that's
Was there an area in that part of the in southwestern Louisiana that did produce maybe like a larger number of men and women that went over there, or was it just all over that it was just nothing anything different on any other area? It's just everybody was kind of signing up.
Yeah. I mean, very few didn't serve,
Yeah.
right? There were a handful who served in like auxiliary units, or stayed at training facilities to train others for whatever reason. But yeah, I mean, we're talking an entire generation served,
Yeah.
in some capacity. If you were of the age of 17 to 22 in 1942, you joined the military. And even for the women, I mean, so many of them, served in the Waves and the WAC, in the Red Cross. They were nurses. I interviewed quite a few nurses. Two of them, one of them became a good friend of mine, Effie Tanner Logan. She was from Lafayette. She was in the LSU medical unit or whatever, and they actually came ashore in Naples, Italy. And she told stories about treating every soldier that you could think of from every country, because that Monte Cassino battle in 44, pitted Germans and Italians against this assortment of allies, from Poland, to Moroccan, to American, French, and they were coming in droves. And so she was, treating a lot of people from different countries. Irma Dolphin, she was 104, and I think she just passed away. She was from the Iota area, Jennings. She actually, believe this or not, she was with the Tulane Medical Corps. If I got that right. LSU, Tulane, one of them. I think she was with Tulane Corps. She came off the ship off the coast of Utah Beach in mid-July of 1944 with the entire medical unit, and came into France that way, after the most of the battle had taken place. So there's a couple of stories that I found of some ladies who served. I believe they were in the WAC, and they were in New Caledonia. New Caledonia was like a hotbed for all the Cajuns. Military kept sending them there. And Noumea was the major city, and it was fairly secure. It was a rest stop for a lot of the Pacific Fleet, and it had a big old harbor, so there was a lot of commerce coming in, and then storing it and sending it out. So a lot of ships were coming in, a very busy port. And she was riding home, and I think her last name was Boudreaux. and she was writing home to her parents saying, "You wouldn't believe, they call me Frenchie, and I've gotten a raise, promoted from whatever she was doing to doing this, and she's actually running a crew that's doing, various type of housekeeping where she had some native New Caledonians because she could speak French, and she was sort of supervising them. Yeah, even into the strange corners of the Pacific, the Frenchies were being called upon. Oh, Jason, you're mute.
Sorry about that. Tara says, I love the stories about the commanders saying who won the war was the Higgins boats. We obviously have an unbelievable influence in Louisiana on World War II. But that's you do hear that all the time. I'm going to close on one final question. I thought this was a great question. Beverly asked, did you interview any soldiers that were taken prisoners?
Oh, many,
Yeah.
many. And just to keep on the Frenchie train here, many of them who ended up either as prisoners with the Germans, or made their way into Germany and took Germans prisoners. One thing that many of them commented on is how the ability to speak French helped them to communicate to Germans, because the German and French language, there's a lot of similarities. And then if you think about where, Germany and France, so many Germans could actually speak French or broken French. And so, there's stories in the book of, even guys who were POWs. Sid Hardy from Breaux Bridge, Louisiana, was a POW for 7 months. And he talked about how he was able to communicate with his captors. Now, 19, 20-year-old guy back somewhere, in a, God knows what kind of conditions he was living in, but just that extra level of comfort, right, and security, knowing that he's able to communicate to the guards who are younger than he is, in many cases, and establishing that relationship, probably helped him, stay positive, and who knows what the outcome would have been. But just about everywhere they went, that ability to be able to speak a second language, proved really valuable. And I think if you look forward into later campaigns, the Korean conflict, Vietnam, the wars in the Middle East, the American military focused heavily on linguistics. They didn't have trained linguistics. They didn't have a linguistic school in World War II. But when the Army needed bilingual French people, they called on this very large pool of Cajuns from South Louisiana to serve in those capacities.
Well, it's a fascinating story, an unbelievable story. I love that you had a lot of women to interview as well. So you got a great uh, aura of all different kinds of people from that area. It really is a wonderful story. And Jason, I want to thank you so much for providing it to us tonight. And congratulations on the book. And thank you so much for speaking tonight.
Hey, Jason, great to be with you guys.
All right. Well, we'll see everybody next week. Next Tuesday, we have Settling St. Malo, A History of Filipino Louisiana with Dr. Randy Gonzalez. So I hope you guys take advantage of that. And thank you so much for being here tonight.